Welcome back to Monday Mod Tips. I'm Captain Xavier, and as promised last time, today we're going to be talking about the difference between a circuit that is in series and a circuit that is in parallel, and how they both work, what's the difference between them, and how they are used in applications like Nerf. In your standard stock blaster, we actually see examples of both, and we will see why they're used where they are, and how they can be used differently depending on the situation. The primary difference is that in a circuit that's in series, the voltages are additive and the current is constant, whereas in a parallel circuit, the current is additive and the voltages are constant. In a stock Nerf blaster, the batteries are in series and the motors are in parallel. Though you can have your batteries in either series or parallel, and you can have your motors in either series or parallel, but they are going to have very different properties and results. Now in series, you have the positive of one element connected to the negative of the next element, and so on and so forth to create a series. You can also do this with your motors. You can have your motors wired positive to negative, and then in your circuit. And the result is, when you're talking about the batteries, the voltage that is generated by the batteries is additive. So if we have a AA battery, which is 1.5 volts, and we add another one in series, we now have 3 volts. And if we add another one, we're at 4.5 volts. And when we add the fourth one, we now have 6 volts total being generated by this, which is what you see in, say, a Strife. With your motors, when you add them together, what is added is the amount of voltage required. So if a single motor only requires 3 volts, if you add another one in series, they now require 6 volts. And if you add the third one, they now require 9 volts to spin at the same RPM. However, the current in this system is constant. So whatever the current or discharge rate or capacity of a single AA, it's the same for the whole thing. They will all drain at the same rate, and they will all discharge at the same rates. So while it provides 4 times the voltage of a single AA, it has the same current and capacity of a single AA. On the motor side, every time you add another motor, the voltage required to make them spin at the same rate goes up, but the current that they draw is whatever the current is of any individual motor, provided that they're all the same. This motor will still only, the whole system will only draw the same amount of current as it would for having a single motor in the line. If we put things in parallel, then instead of connecting negative, positive, negative, positive, negative, positive, we're connecting all of the negatives and we're connecting all of the positives. And again, we can do this with either the batteries or the motors. And this is how the motors are usually wired in a flywheel blaster. The battery housing is usually in series, the motors are usually in parallel. And what this does is the voltages are now constant, but the capacity or the current required or provided is the same. So if we hook all of the positives across the top and then connect that to the positive of our motors, and all the negatives across the bottom and connect that to the negatives of our motors, we will only be generating 1.5 volts, which is insufficient for these motors, but that's not really the point. But the current that they are capable of providing is now 4 times higher. On the other side, when we connect all of the negatives and all of the positives on our motors, the voltage required to make them all spin is now constant. They only require 3 volts if that's what these are rated for. But the current necessary is now 3 times higher because we have 3 times as many motors all drawing that same amount of current. Now, as stated, in a stock flywheel blaster, we'll take a Strife because it's the simplest. The batteries are in series, giving us a total of 6 volts in a Strife. Here we're working with 3. And the motors would be set up in parallel. Now we're going to start with a single motor so that you can see roughly the speed. It's kind of hard to tell exactly, but hopefully between sound and you might be able to see some of the oscillation going on in there. But that is what happens when we hook a single motor up to this system. If we add a second motor in parallel, so the negatives are connected and the positives are connected, they should spin at roughly that same speed. And they do appear to. And this is because because they are in parallel, they require the same amount of voltage. They are now drawing twice the current, but these batteries are capable of providing enough current to both motors, and so the performance stays roughly the same. We also are not at risk of overdrawing our batteries and causing damage. If we now add a third motor, we may now actually see a difference in performance, which I think it is slightly, because now we are potentially overdrawing the amount of current that these batteries are able to generate. The voltage is still the same, but the current requirement of the parallel is increased. The issue of not having enough current can be alleviated by adding more current. And in this case, I've done so by adding another battery in parallel. Remember, when we put things in parallel, it increases the current, but not the voltage. So the motors aren't going to spin any faster, or not a lot faster, but their performance will be better because we now have sufficient current for the increased size of our motor assembly. So we have the positives of the two batteries connected, and we have the negatives of the two batteries connected, and then we have the positive going to the motors and the negative going to the motors. And now when we spin it up, it spins up a little bit better. This motor is starting to give on me. Hopefully it'll last this whole video. Now let's see what happens if we put the whole thing in series instead. We start, of course, with our single motor, single battery setup, just like we did before, and the motor spins at the rate it wants to spin at. When we add the next motor in serial, so we've connected the negative of this motor to the positive of this motor, we now have doubled the required amount of voltage that the system has, and when we try to turn it on, they spin decidedly slower. And when we add the third motor into the series, now they're barely spinning at all, and it's entirely possible that the system will simply not work, because there simply isn't enough voltage to get all of the motors to spin at the speed that they want to be spinning at. So how do we alleviate this problem? We alleviate this problem by adding in another battery in series. So we are now going to connect the positive of this to the negative of this, and that goes into the circuit, and now the whole system is capable of spinning even, at a higher speed. Now it would like to be spinning at a faster speed, but we only have the two battery housings. So this is what SF Edwards had done in his blaster. He had put all of the motors in series and then put all of the batteries in series. And it was pointed out to me that the way I rewired it was actually incorrect for the batteries that he was using. He was using IMRs, which are a low current battery, and that's why we don't recommend using them in upgraded blasters. In fact, that's why we very much discourage using them in upgraded blasters, because the upgraded motors that we use, Valkyries and Krakens and Fang revamps and Michelle 2s and all of those, they're high torque motors, which is why we use them. They can spin up the flywheels, and they can operate under high crush and all of that. But to get high torque, they're very high current. And that's why you need to use a LiPo with them, because LiPos can produce enough current to safely operate those motors. If you try using IMRs, if the motors draw too much current, the IMRs can overheat, which will damage them. If they overheat too far, they can in fact have a catastrophic failure. Or if you damage them too much, when you go to recharge them, they will have a catastrophic failure. And that's the real risk, because if they have a catastrophic failure on the charger, while you've got it plugged into your wall, if you're not paying attention, it can light your house on fire. So that is why people are so adamantly opposed to the use of IMRs, because if people don't realize the risks and they use them in a high torque, high current system, it does become very, very dangerous. But the way SF Edwards had wired his blaster kind of got around that issue. He had the motors wired in series, which means they required higher voltage, which is why he needed so many IMRs, but it didn't require as much current. You only needed as much current as one motor. So they were drawing far less current than a normal parallel system would, but had a huge amount of voltage going through it, which is a whole different issue. That was also, it still wasn't a good way of doing it. It was much better off to wire it in parallel and use a LiPo. There is a reason that we all do it that way. It is safer, it is better, it is just a superior system in general. But his system was safer than it could have been. And the way I rewired it on IMRs was then not as good, because I put them in parallel, so they were pulling more current. But I knew that as soon as I handed it off to him, he was going to rewire it for LiPo, so that's why I did that. But a series would require less. The downside is you are now putting far more voltage through the system than the components were required, and that can be just as bad. So we're going to quickly go back to a single motor setup in order to illustrate the difference that having your batteries in parallel or series will do. So here's how it spins when it's got the 3 volts going to a single motor. If we add in the second battery pack in series, you can notice that it is going much faster and is much louder now because we've doubled the voltage. Whereas, if we put it in parallel, so we hook up both negatives, we hook the negatives together, we hook the positives together, now when we turn it on, it's spinning at the same rate that it was before. And that is because we have not increased the voltage, we've only increased the current. And the motor will only draw as much current as it needs. Whereas if you force more voltage through, it doesn't have any choice but to spin faster. But it will only take as much current as it needs. What this will do is it will double the life of the batteries. They are now you're now drawing the same amount of current, but from twice as many batteries, and so it will take twice as long to actually drain them. So if you want a really long life in your blaster, you can put multiple batteries in parallel. Namely, connect all the negatives, connect all the positives, connect those into your system, and it will last twice as long. Now, I consider all of this to be considerably more advanced than a lot of my previous videos. I had to do research just to learn all of this, and I probably got stuff wrong. If I did, do feel free to correct me in the comments. If it's a minor mistake, I'll just put a note in the description. If it's a serious mistake and I've got this all completely wrong, I'll redo the video entirely. So this is stuff you really need to know what you're doing before you get into. If you're going to be connecting multiple battery packs in parallel, or hooking up multiple battery packs in series, you absolutely need to know what you're doing, because if you do it incorrectly, you can short out your batteries, and that can be very catastrophic when you're dealing with really high capacity batteries like we tend to be dealing with. You absolutely never want to connect the negative of your battery directly to the positive of your battery without something in between. You need to have something that provides resistance. A motor or an LED or something needs to be in between. Or the battery will simply drain as fast as it possibly can, and very bad things can and will happen. So the concept of having multiple batteries in parallel to increase your capacity, or the idea of hooking multiple batteries in series to give you multiple, or to get you increased voltage, this is how it works, but I encourage you to be very sure that you're knowing what you're doing. Double check your wiring. Make sure you have an actual diagram that charts everything out before you start tinkering. And never test the system with your LiPo. Use something like a standard 9-volt battery. It has the voltage to be able to to get the system to at least check to make sure that everything is wired correctly, but those things are so stable that even if you do just connect them directly up, all it's going to do is get a little bit warm. It's not going to explode on you. Whereas if you have a short circuit and you plug your LiPo in, it can go catastrophically wrong before you even realize that it's happening, and the battery can swell up and bad things will happen. But hopefully this will give you some idea of how to use series circuits and parallel circuits to the full advantage if you're doing a really complicated build that has a lot of components and needs a lot of voltage or needs a lot of current. This is how you can stack them properly and how you can make it all work properly. So hopefully this is correct, hopefully this was helpful, and thank you guys for watching.